leader is dead, executed like a common criminal. But then, stories of resurrection and an impossible mission. Jesus' chosen 12, the apostles, are instructed to carry a new faith to the ends of the earth. Thomas, Bartholomew, and Matthias are said to have blazed a trail east. Stories steeped in legend, myth, and magic. Missionaries evangelizing on unfamiliar ground.
The threat was real.
One conversion at a time, clashing with the old order, climaxing in deadly confrontations.
They will be beaten, they will be scourged, they will be tortured.
The stories of their martyrdom enshrine them in history and inspire the faithful. The state of Kerala in southwest India. Each year, festivals overrun the streets here. This town is ablaze in pageantry, music, and dance. It's a religious celebration, the Adupati Perunal. To an outsider, it might look like any one of the many Hindu festivals taking place across the country. But look closer. Those are Christian saints emblazoned on the elephant's ornate headgear. The faithful here are among the estimated 24 million Christians living in India today. Locals believe the roots of Christianity run deep here. Almost 2,000 years to the year 52 AD. We are nearly 5,000 kilometers from Jerusalem. How did Christianity gain a foothold so far away? According to many Christians in India, Jesus' closest followers delivered the gospel here personally. That story isn't found in the Bible. The tale is a mix of apocrypha, local legends, and folklore. The story of how some Indian Christians believe their faith came east begins at a Roman execution in 33 AD. Jesus of Nazareth, sentenced to die for claiming to be a king.
He died a very humble death. He was humiliated. He died on the cross, a cruel death, but that became the basis of salvation according to the Christian faith.
Jesus was betrayed by one of his closest followers, turned in by one of his own apostles. In the Bible's book of Luke, Judas betrayed his Messiah for 30 pieces of silver. Almost immediately, he is overcome by the bloody result of his own treachery.
Even though many of the medieval sources are unconcerned with Judas's potential remorse, he has to have felt this unbelievable burden of guilt for having betrayed not only Jesus, but having betrayed the entire mission to which he had devoted a good portion of his time and his energy and his life. And he must have felt in betraying Jesus, he was betraying the faith of all of the apostles, all of the disciples.
And in some stories, he tries to give back the 30 pieces of silver that he received as the price for having betrayed his teacher.
He couldn't contain his despair, so he committed suicide.
The Bible says 3 days later, Jesus rises from the dead, appears on and off for 40 days, then ascends to heaven. The closest followers of Jesus, the apostles, meet 10 days later on the Jewish holy day of Pentecost, 50 days since the crucifixion. With Judas dead, the apostles elect a replacement. The book of Acts says they choose this man, Matthias, from a group of more than 100 disciples.
Now, Matthias is very desperate to prove himself because he's the new guy. He's the new apostle who's been chosen to take the place of the worst possible betrayer.
And once that choice is made, Matthias becomes one of the 12, completely equal with them and part of their ministry going forward.
But what has Matthias signed up for? The apostles have no leader now, no clear mission. Jesus said he'd send a sign, but not when he'd send it. Then everything changes at once. The Bible describes a deafening noise and an incredible light called tongues of flame in the scripture. The apostles are given a miraculous gift, the ability to speak every language of the world. The apostles first go out and preach in Jerusalem. Their boldness attracts the wrong sort of attention. The temple's high priest arrests the apostles to maintain order. They don't stay in jail for long. The Bible says an angel of the Lord appears and sets the apostles free. The apostles make up their mind. They will flee Jerusalem and take the word of Jesus to the four corners of the earth. The apostles who will head east are a peculiar bunch. Thomas, most famous for doubting the resurrection.
He said, I will believe only if I see him and put my fingers on the wounds of his body. So that is why he is called Doubting Thomas.
Bartholomew, sometimes called Nathaniel. He had his doubts about Jesus from the very beginning. The Gospel of John says he once asked if anything good could come from Nazareth. And then there's Matthias, the newest apostle. Elected just before Pentecost, begins his mission to spread the word of Jesus. So does Bartholomew. He had his reservations about Jesus before. Now he's leaving everything behind to spread the gospel.
The apostles were taking a big risk when they left Jerusalem.
The Golden Legend reports a story told by Saint Theodore, a Byzantine monk, which concerns the apostle Bartholomew. So according to Saint Theodore, Bartholomew received a vision from Jesus telling him to go, and saying in particular, go and fight. You are fit to fight.
The legend says Thomas, perhaps still haunted by his doubts, doesn't leave Jerusalem just yet.
Now, the Apostle Thomas, who is often referred to as Doubting Thomas, largely because he was interested in empirical evidence, he needed proof, and he needed proof of just about everything.
But it is Thomas, the doubting apostle, who the Christians of India credit with founding 7 congregations in that country. How did the apostle, with the most uncertainty about his mission, make such an indelible mark so far away? Kerala, India. Every day, dozens of devoted Christians gather here to follow in the footsteps of the Apostle Thomas. Climbing the hill is not an easy task. The site supposedly visited by the apostle in the 1st century sits 1,269 feet above sea level. Many pilgrims carry large crosses uphill to this place where they believe the apostle once walked.
When you climb this hill and you feel it, the calmness, the peace of mind, you will experience it. The calmness of the surrounding areas and all these things. Like that, to praying to St. Thomas and visiting all these places, it will give that in the sense there is a spiritual experience, a happiness in the mind. That's
A story of Thomas, handed down for generations in song, says these are the very footprints of the apostle, miraculously preserved.
They believe that this is the footprint of St. Thomas. So people are coming to see the footprints. That is why it is kept in this way, its natural way.
Another verse says Thomas drew a cross into a rock here, and that later this golden cross sprung up in its place.
This is the golden cross. According to the tradition, St. Thomas has prayed on the rock of this area, and miraculously he depicted when he signed on the cross, he has depicted in the rock, and it was changed into a golden cross. The ancient fathers also said about this matter, and we believe that, and that way it goes on. So that's why thousands of people are coming and venerated to see the golden cross.
പിതാവിന്റെയും പുത്രന്റെയും പരിശുദ്ധാത്മാവിന്റെയും നാമത്തിൽ ആമേൻ.
People here believe the apostle was destined to bring the word of Jesus to India. But in the Acts of Thomas, the apocryphal text from the 3rd century, Thomas doesn't answer that call immediately. Thomas was famously skeptical when Jesus rose from the dead. In the days following Pentecost, Thomas remains in Jerusalem, even when others have departed. The other apostles heading east set off on their missions to spread the gospel. The apostles would have quickly learned there is little law on the roads and traveling paths of the ancient world.
Traveling through the desert or traveling through the wilds of Asia Minor would have been a pretty daunting proposition. These were very sparsely inhabited desert wastelands in which Roman authority was somewhat thin on the ground. So protection from bandits or any other kind of threat would have been very hard to find. And the idea that a party traveling simply could be attacked was very real.
There were obvious dangers involved in making passage by walking. There were bandits, there were wild animals. Some of the ancient documents talk about finding skeletons along the way.
It would have been a very long journey by foot, and there was always the possibility of bandits, there was always the possibility of illness, there was always the possibility of not having enough provisions. And of course, if you were well stocked with provisions, then that made you even more of a target.
It's a rough and hostile world the apostles have entered. Precious little information is known about the ministry of the newest apostle. After Pentecost, Matthias disappears from the official books of the Bible. One Byzantine historian, Nicephorus, claims Matthias preached in Judea and along the Black Sea in modern-day Georgia. According to the book of Acts, when the apostles received their missions, they also gained supernatural power. Apostle lore says all the apostles convinced converts through miracles, healings, magic duels, and battling demons.
You don't have any type of health care for mental illness. having someone who can perform exorcisms, who can quiet those issues with people's minds and mental states and psychological behavior is incredibly effective.
Casting out demons becomes a testament to the power of the apostle. And so exorcism is a primary component of these early conversion narratives.
Back in Jerusalem, the Acts of Thomas says Jesus comes to Thomas in a dream. In the dream, Jesus makes his purpose for Thomas clear.
So in this dream, Jesus appears to Thomas and says, I am sending you to India.
He is told by Jesus to go on a mission, his apostolic mission to India, but he's reluctant. He doesn't want to go.
Apparently, they had very little knowledge of India at that time. And then maybe there were prejudices out of ignorance about India, that they were going to a country of barbarians.
And still, Thomas doubts.
And Thomas immediately responds, Lord, send me anywhere.
Send me anywhere but India.
He did not want to go. He said, give me any other country, I will go there. But don't give me India, he said.
He may not be welcomed. He's coming to tell them, especially the Jewish community, that there has been this great development in Judaism, and will he be accepted or not?
Jesus has a special plan for Thomas, a different sort of mission.
Jesus insists, no, you must go, and you are going to go as an architect. The king is looking for someone who can build buildings in the Roman style.
Thomas is, of course, a bit annoyed. He's not very happy about going to India still.
And of course, Jesus needs to cajole him and says, look, if you go and build a mansion, then I promise you the palm of martyrdom.
So Thomas eventually, after some persuading, decides to go along with this plan.
Bartholomew was also called to head towards India, according to the 4th century historian Eusebius. When Bartholomew arrives on the Indian subcontinent, he brings with him the Gospel of Matthew. It tells Jesus' story and commands his flock to go and make disciples of all the nations. And Bartholomew keeps moving. The Malabar coast of India. According to Indian Christians, this is the place where the Apostle Thomas first landed in the year 52 AD. The statuary here commemorates the Apostle's most famous attribute, his doubting nature. In the Acts of Thomas, the Apostle is a reluctant missionary. Only after Jesus appeared to him personally did he accept his mission and head to India, posing as an architect. A powerful client, King Gundaphorus, commissions the would-be architect to build him a new palace in the Roman style.
In India, in the tradition of iconography, Thomas is depicted with the instruments of a mason, of an architect. So probably he was skilled in architecture, in house building and so on.
So King Gundeforce is eager to welcome his new, as he thinks, architect, and has Thomas draw up a number of plans.
He does a plan for a palace of some sort, maybe a model. The king is very impressed with this palace that the apostle proposes to build.
However, the king makes one mistake. Having raised all of this money and given Thomas the approval, he then leaves the province for the next 2 years.
Thomas has no plans to build anything, at least not in this world. But he does have plans for the king's money.
Thomas does something strange. He takes the money and he distributes it to the poor.
And after some time, the king was checking with him, how far is the construction? Did you erect the palace you are commissioned for? And then Thomas said yes. But actually when the king came to see the palace, there was nothing.
The king comes back from his 2-year journey, and there's no palace. He asks, where's the palace? What happened to the money? Thomas tells him he gave the money to the poor. Well, that isn't building me a palace. Thomas says, well, I've built you a better palace, but it's in heaven.
Thomas's mission to India has only just begun, and he's already facing the wrath of a furious king.
The king comes back to find no palace, no money, and a whole lot of Christians. Not liking any of this outcome, he then jails Thomas and wants to execute him.
He decides that he's going to have Thomas flayed and burned alive. Thomas's response to the king was, I did build you a palace, but it's in heaven.
And the king was furious that he took money from the king and he was cheating the king. So he was jailed.
At exactly this moment, the story says fate intervenes.
It's just so happened that the king's brother Gad has died of an illness very suddenly.
The king's brother happens to die. And then come back to life several days later.
So immediately the king wants to know what on earth has happened here.
The king's brother recounts a remarkable vision of the afterlife.
He went to heaven, and then an angel was showing him around the beautiful palaces.
And the angel explains to him, this is the palace that has been built by Thomas with all of these alms for the poor and all of this preaching. You cannot take your earthly treasure with you.
He knows the king is so angry he's about ready to kill Thomas for taking that money. And he says, no, my brother.
Gad, having seen his brother's palace in heaven, tells him, you must forgive the apostle. He has done as he promised. He has built you a palace. It's just not an earthly palace, it's a heavenly palace.
Thomas warns the king he can only receive his heavenly reward if he converts to Christianity
And Thomas says, essentially, in my Father's house are many mansions, and they are bought with prayer and in distributing the wealth among the poor. And so finally the king realizes that the only palace that he will ever achieve is that in heaven, and he converts and forgives Thomas.
Moved by the power of the vision and the apostles' words, the king releases Thomas. King Gundaforus and his brother Gad convert.
Baptism in this era would not have been anything particularly beautiful. It would have been somebody being dunked into a river and cleansed in a symbolic act of creating a new beginning.
Thomas baptizes both brothers. This event, as portrayed in the Acts of Thomas, is a pivotal moment in the establishment of a new religion in northwest India, now Pakistan. Palayor, India. Some say this 17th century house of worship stands on 2,000 years of history. They believe this spot is where St. Thomas founded his first church in India. Some Indian Christians claim they descend from ancient members of the Brahmin class, the highest rung of the Indian caste system. Thomas would also have found Jews here. The ruins of a synagogue can be found just 200 meters away. Also nearby, a place where oral tradition says Thomas performed miracles, casting water into the air, where it hung suspended in time and sparkled like diamonds. Witnesses were converted and baptized on the spot. The story doesn't let Thomas rest after the conversion of the king and his brother. He takes his mission further. He heads east towards the Indian coast on the Bay of Bengal. According to the Golden Legend, after a mission to the outskirts of Judea, the newest apostle has run into trouble of his own. Matthias, who replaced the treacherous Judas, faces violent resistance.
Matthias continues his ministry in the Holy Land. And eventually, in Jerusalem, he's brought up before the Sanhedrin with enough evidence provided by false witnesses that would justify his stoning.
Matthias is betrayed by two witnesses in Judea, and they begin to stone him to death. In the middle of being stoned to death, he is actually finished off by beheading in the Roman manner of execution.
The Golden Legend said he was beheaded with an axe, but other sources have him beheaded with a sword. And so, like many of the apostles, the actual account of his death varies depending on the sources.
After delivering the Gospel of Matthew to India, the Apostle Bartholomew begins heading back west towards Jerusalem. The apocryphal Acts of Philip says he travels with that apostle towards the Greek city of Hierapolis in modern-day Turkey. There, Philip converts the wife of a Roman official, infuriating her husband. Philip and Bartholomew are arrested and sentenced to death. Some accounts say they are hung from a tree, others hooks, and others still a cross. Most insist Philip is hung upside down. Even as they hang, Philip preaches from the cross. He draws a crowd. They're moved by the words of the dying man. They demand the apostles be cut down. Bartholomew is saved. But Philip refuses the crowd's mercy. To the apostles, martyrdom is a victory. He insists he be left on the cross to die. Bartholomew will live to preach another day. Believe it or not, the legends have an even worse fate in store for him. Bartholomew continues heading east to Armenia. One tradition says chance reunites him with another apostle, Jude, who has been evangelizing through modern-day Turkey and Armenia. The Golden Legend says the duo has tremendous success here. Today, these two apostles are credited with founding the Armenian Apostolic Church and called the first illuminators of Armenia. But one final conversion will cost the apostle his life. Bartholomew converts an Armenian king. The king's outraged brother has him arrested. Accounts of Bartholomew's martyrdom vary wildly. It's not anywhere in the Bible, but it's been passed on in folklore, legend, and art history. The accounts are brutal, horrific, and ghastly. In India, the Golden Legend says Thomas's continued mission gains momentum and attracts converts. Historians now believe many of the apostles' early converts are women who finance their ministries and host congregations in their homes.
Thomas continues his ministry in the rest of India. He goes to other parts of India and continues his conversion. And of course, towards the end of his time there, he goes to Upper India and converts the wife of a king. And in converting her, convinces her that she must remain chaste, that she must adopt an attitude of virginity. Thomas seems to be luring all of the women and all of the wives away from their husbands and essentially telling them not to have sex with their husbands.
The legend says Thomas converts King Misdaeus' wife and tells her to withhold sex from the king until he converts too.
This does not please the king, who wants to know why his wife will no longer share his bed with him.
So the king calls Thomas to him and says, "Please, let us have our wives back." And Thomas refuses, so he's thrown into prison.
Thomas is imprisoned on orders of the king.
The king reacts by jailing Thomas and then having him tortured. But
then his life is spared. Apparently, by miraculous intervention.
By a miracle in which springs of water miraculously come up from the ground and essentially put out the fire.
God sends water springing up out of the ground. Thomas begins to mock the fact that the king is worshiping demons and these idols.
I believe that St. Thomas was a brave man. He was characterized as a brave man, a brave apostle of Jesus Christ in the pages of the Gospel.
We don't know what was the religion Misdeis or Vasudeva followed at that time. Apparently, he was an idol worshipper. Thomas was against idol worship.
King is horrified. He says, "Are you speaking to me like my equal?" He decides, "I'll throw him into a furnace."
The king is outraged. He condemns Thomas to a painful death. But the legend will not allow the Apostle Thomas to die so easily.
Then he's thrown into a fiery furnace, but the furnace extinguishes immediately.
God saves Thomas again from the fire of the furnace.
Undeterred, the king then attempts to throw Thomas into a furnace, the golden legend tells us. But that does not work, and he emerges from this white-hot furnace completely unharmed.
King Misdeis will not give up. He wants the apostle dead, and he won't stop until Thomas is no longer a threat to the established order.
So the king has finally had enough of Thomas and decides to have him killed, but he doesn't want to have him killed in the city where Thomas's followers are going to be upset.
So the king, determined to finish off Thomas, has soldiers take him up to a hill and stab him to death with spears.
But of course, in the Indian Christian tradition, Thomas actually survives the blow to a sword and drags himself to a cave.
The local legend is that Thomas does not die immediately, but crawls off to a nearby cave.
Thomas manages to crawl into a cave, and he goes to God.
The legend ends here. The cave where Thomas supposedly died is still a site of pilgrimage for Indian Christians today. But what about the king who killed him? The golden legend gives him a second chance. King Misdeis soon finds himself in need of a miracle. His son is sick. Nobody can cure him.
The king that killed St. Thomas has a son who falls very sick after Thomas is dead.
The king eventually starts to see the wisdom of his queen's new faith when their son falls ill.
Willing to try anything, the king visits the apostle's grave.
According to the Acts of Thomas, even after Thomas's death, the queen remains a faithful convert and, in fact, helps to establish the first church. And eventually, even the king who had him killed converts.
In desperation, he decides to go to Thomas's tomb and take a bone. He understands how relics work. He knows that an apostle's bones should have tremendous healing powers. Instead, when he goes to the tomb, it's empty, and there are no bones there. His body has miraculously disappeared. So the king takes some soil from the tomb on his son instead. It proved just as efficacious, and the son is cured, thereby finally converting the king to believing Thomas's faith.
The king converts to Christianity and is forgiven. The legend says he is actually welcomed into one of 7 churches founded by Thomas, churches that still exist to this day. When the sun sets on the Adipati Perunal, the faithful gather to pray and give thanks. This 2-day festival of praise, parades, and music celebrates a different saint, St. George. But many of the 24 million Christians in India trace their origins to Thomas. The apostle so famous for doubting is said to have left an indelible mark. The seed they believe Thomas planted here bears fruit in traditions that are at once distinctly Christian and uniquely Indian. To this day, the stories of the apostles who headed east remain twisting tales of Bible verse, legend, and folklore. These are the legendary first steps of Christianity's journey from Jesus' closest followers to a worldwide faith